Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. Do the Gospels tell the truth about Jesus? That's what I'm going to be asking my next guest in this episode. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, and community college campuses throughout the world. However, just a few years ago, we started Ratio Christi College Prep. This is the high school level Ratio Christi, and the reason we started this is because of the fact that we can prepare students for what they will face in college once they get there. At the college level, this is where we get the statistic of this 50 to 80% fall away rate of church-going youth who leave the church after high school or by the time they're 22 years old. The Ratio Christi College Prep, we can prepare them for what they will face in college once they get there and just get them prepared that much sooner to give a defense for why they believe what they believe. Just go to ratiochristi.org, go up to the top, click on RCCP or Ratio Christi College Prep to find out more about that. The purpose of our organization is to help make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to point people to truth with a capital T, which is why we call our program Truth Matters. Joining me is John Stewart. John is a lawyer, Christian apologist, author, and international speaker. He holds 4 earned degrees, including an undergraduate degree in biblical studies, a master's in theological studies, and a doctorate in law. John currently serves as scholar in residence for Ratio Christi and speaks on behalf of the ministry he co-founded called Intelligent Faith. He has written 5 books. The most recent just came out last month. It's called In Defense of the Gospels, The Case for Reliability. You can find this on Amazon or anywhere where fine books are sold, so we want to definitely encourage you to get a copy of that. But John is also a former radio personality, and he co-hosted the Bible Answer Man show with Dr. Walter Martin and hosted his own talk show in Los Angeles for many years as well. John, welcome to Truth Matters.
Thank you, Tony. Great being with you.
It's great to have you here to talk about this vital topic, this always timely topic when it comes to skeptics who we talk to on college campuses and anywhere else, really. You've written a book called In Defense of the Gospels. Some people watching might be wondering why the Gospels need to be defended in the first place. So why is this subject so important?
Well, Tony, first of all, the term gospel means good news, and the word gospel with a capital G refers to the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These books tell us about the life and the teachings of Jesus. And for 1,800 years, virtually no one challenged the gospel accounts. In fact, the term gospel took on a secondary meaning, perhaps 600 or 700 years ago, to refer to something that was unquestionably true. So a person might say, I saw Jack and Jill go up the hill holding hands. That's gospel. But in the last 50 years or so, we've seen a rise of skepticism toward Christianity and an increasing biblical illiteracy. So as a result, the Gospels no longer enjoy the same favored position. Now it's common for people to wonder, are the Gospels even accurate stories of the life of Jesus?
In your book, In Defense of the Gospels, as people can see there, the subtitle is The Case for Reliability. How can you show the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus are reliable? Because a lot of people wonder, well, isn't the question of whether the stories of Jesus are true just a matter of faith to begin with?
Well, Tony, the issue of whether the Gospels are reliable is not a matter of faith any more than the guilt or innocence of an accused person in a courtroom and a trial is a matter of faith. I'm a lawyer, and I know you don't deal with faith, you deal with facts, you deal with evidence. And so a lot of folks do think the question of whether the gospel is reliable has to do with faith, and therefore it's outside the realm of what we might call proof or evidence. That's just not true. Accounts of the Gospels can be investigated, and these accounts are supported by corroborating evidence. Now, the threshold question in determining the reliability of the Gospels is to ask this: what type of literature are the Gospels? Are they meant to be accurate historical accounts of the life of Jesus, or are they religious fiction? Now, some skeptics used to think the Gospels are a type of religious fiction divorced from any historical foundation. But about 25 years ago, an Anglican scholar named Richard Burridge came out with a book that put to rest the skeptics' claims. Burridge shows the Gospels are actually ancient biographies written in the same style as ancient writers like Plutarch when he wrote Lives, or Suetonius, the 12 Caesars. So the view that the Gospels were ancient biographies is not new. In fact, in the middle of the 2nd century, around the year AD 160, an early Christian defender of the faith named Justin Martyr referred to the memorabilia of the apostles. That's the same word that was used for Xenophon's biography of Socrates, meaning the Gospels are biographies. So to confirm the genre of the Gospels, how do they start out? Did they start out a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away? No. For example, if you look in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, verse 1, it starts out, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was a tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip was a tetrarch of the region of Iturea, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. That tells you there's a historical context. So therefore, that's just one example to show the Gospels are rooted in history, and they constitute ancient biographies of Jesus, written in the same style as other biographies of the era. And if the Gospels were intended to be biographies of Jesus, then the question is, well, how do we know that they're accurate? How do we know their accounts are accurate? So to answer that question, there's 6 main issues that I address in my book in defense of the Gospels. Answer these half-dozen questions, and you've made a case for the reliability of the Gospels. The issues are, when were the Gospels written? Were they written close enough in time to the events that they could be accurately remembered? Number 2, who wrote the Gospels? Were they eyewitnesses, or are the Gospels, in fact, anonymous? Number 3, were the writers biased, or do they show earmarks of being historically reliable and honest? Number 4, are there lost Gospels? Are there books that were taken out of the Bible that should be in there? 5, have the Gospels been changed over the years? A very common question people ask. Were things added? Were things deleted? And lastly, do history and archaeology confirm the accuracy of the Gospels? Answer those 6 questions, you make a case the Gospels can be trusted.
And those 6 questions are usually the same accusations that many college students make on college campuses. They haven't done the research for themselves. They hear something, they go repeat it, and they actually don't look for the evidence and where it actually points. So let's address these 6 critical issues that you have in your book. First, when were the Gospels written, and why is this so important?
Well, Tony, virtually all scholars, even those skeptical, will agree the Gospels were written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses were still alive when these things were written. And that's important because if the Gospels contain material about Jesus that was not true, well, the eyewitnesses could have challenged the account, but there's no record of any witnesses disputing the Gospel record. Now, we're not sure of the exact dates the Gospels were written, but there is good evidence that all of the Gospels were written before the year AD 70, about 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so, for example, if you look in John chapter 5, the Gospel of John, according to many scholars, was the last of the 4 Gospels written. And in John 5:2, it says, there is in Jerusalem a sheep gate. Well, after AD 70, when the temple was destroyed and the walls of Jerusalem was destroyed, there was no longer a sheep gate. So whoever's writing the Gospel of John, which I believe was John the Apostle, is writing fairly clearly before the year AD 70. And there are also some liberal scholars, such as James Crossley and John A.T. Robinson, that are convinced that the Gospels are written within 10 to 15 years of the life of Jesus, at least in the case of the Gospel of Mark. So even if someone is convinced that the Gospels are written at the end of the 1st century, well, studies show that the memories of unique events can be captured by the memory, just like a snapshot. So, for example, if I asked your audience members, do they remember their marriage proposal or perhaps the birth of their first child? Do you remember that? Well, of course they do. And the more unusual and the more emotional the event, the more likely someone is going to accurately remember the details, even 50 years later. So think, for example, of 9/11, that was 17 years ago, or those who are old enough like me to remember 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated, that was 55 years ago. So memories of these types of events can be crystal clear, and I believe in the case of the Gospels, good evidence supports that conclusion.
And these impact events definitely stick out. And all these impact event examples that you gave weren't even seeing someone alive, seeing them dead, and then seeing them alive again. I mean, that's definitely got to be the greatest impact event that someone will definitely remember the details about. Is there really an issue as to who wrote the Gospels. If you look at any Bible, it will say Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, etc. Why is this even an issue to begin with?
Tony, there are skeptics today, such as the former evangelical Bart Ehrman, who now identifies as a, quote, agnostic leaning toward atheism, close quote. People like him who claim the Gospels are anonymous. Now, that's a very misleading claim. While it is true that within the text of each of the Gospels, the writers are not mentioned, unlike Paul in his letters where he'll say Paul, an apostle, writing, to the Corinthians, for example, there's plenty of evidence that supports the traditional authors. For example, just after the turn of the first century, around the year AD 110, an early church writer named Papias, who was actually a disciple of John the Apostle, he tells us that Matthew, the disciple, wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And he also tells us that Mark wrote the accounts of Peter, so that Mark is actually the recorder of the eyewitness account of the Apostle Peter. So this tells us within 10 years after the turn of the first century that Matthew wrote Matthew, that Mark wrote Mark. Also, by the middle of the second century, a man named Irenaeus, an early church father, he wrote around the year AD 70, he confirms that the Gospels of Luke and John are written by those who bear their names. So I set forth in my book much other documentation that confirms traditional authorship. You can look at things like the Muratorium Canon. It's an early list of the biblical books, and it contains all four Gospels. The beginning of that canon is actually fragmented, so it doesn't mention Matthew and Mark by name, but it references four Gospels. It does reference Luke and John. Also, what's very important to know is there is no tradition of anyone other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the authors of the Gospels. And if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the Gospels, there's really no credible evidence as to why Matthew's name would be appended to the first Gospel or Mark's name to the second Gospel. I mean, Mark is not an apostle. He's not an eyewitness. There's no reason other than the fact that he was writing the recollections of Peter for him to have a gospel that bears his name. So the evidence militates the conclusion, yes, the traditional authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the writers.
And John, I think a lot of people don't even realize that, they can make accusations all day or say, well, they probably weren't the writer of it, but an assertion is not an argument. Unless someone can actually give evidence, well, no, look at the solid evidence that somebody else actually wrote it. Well, then, they're not wasting your time per se, because obviously we want to get the truth out to people. But still, just you want to keep the burden of proof on the person who makes the claim, of course. And many people will say, well, look at the bias here, though. John, the traditional gospel writers were followers of Jesus, so doesn't that call into question the accounts and the honesty that they could have even had when writing them down? I mean, if they believe that Jesus is the Messiah, well, yeah, it's because they're biased, and their bias undermines their reliability as the writers. What's your response to that?
Well, Tony, yes, it's true. The writers of the Gospels sure appear to be followers of Jesus. But if you saw someone crucified and then rising from the dead 3 days later, you might also be in a position to be a follower of Jesus. But let's step back. Could the Gospels writers have written embellished accounts that, frankly, were just works of fiction? And that question, in fact, was answered by one of the most skeptical of scholars of the late 20th century, a man named Robert Funk. He is one of the co-founders of what was called the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar was a group of liberal, left-leaning, not Bible-believing scholars who actually sat and voted on whether or not any of the words in the Gospels were authentic as coming from Jesus. They concluded that maybe 15 to 20% of the words were authentic. But even Robert Funk, despite being a liberal, raised an issue as to how do we know the Gospels can be trusted? And he sets forth a criterion that helps determine and answer that question. Is a historical account honest and accurate, or is it embellished? And he called it the criterion of embarrassment. If someone is writing fiction, they only put things in the account that makes the main characters look good. So what do you find in the Gospels? First of all, let's talk about Jesus. He's called a winebibber. He's accused of working under the power of Satan. He's accused of breaking the Sabbath. He's misunderstood by his followers. In fact, even his own family thought that somehow he was deluded and perhaps he was out of his mind. They went to take care of him. Well, that's not the kind of stuff you write about the main character unless it's true. Now, when you talk about the disciples, now it gets even worse. Here are at least two of the disciples who are writing gospel accounts, Matthew and John, and likely the Gospel of Mark is the account of Peter. What do you find in those accounts about these 12 disciples of Jesus? Well, you have one who's a betrayer, Judas Iscariot. You have another, Peter, whose Gospel Mark is writing, who denies Jesus 3 times. This is not the kind of stuff you put into a fictional account because you want to make the characters look good. And so this criterion of embarrassment says, you know, the Gospels are telling us the unvarnished truth, both the good and the bad. Jesus tells the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane right before he's arrested and taken to trial, watch and pray. He tells them 3 times, watch and pray. What do? They fall asleep. And perhaps one thing that might relate carefully to the men who were watching this, who is at the foot of the cross as Jesus is being crucified? As the authority of Rome is invoking its ultimate penalty in crucifying Jesus in a painful death on the cross, who's there? Only one of the 12 disciples, John. But you have 3 women who were there. And so you have the women who had the courage to stand there defying Rome, whereas the disciples themselves had scattered, except for John. That's not the type of stuff that a man would write because we want to put ourselves as the heroes, the macho people who were there to defend to the death Jesus, but they weren't. Why? Because the gospel writers are telling the truth. So the criterion of embarrassment tells us the gospel accounts are not embellished. They're in fact accounts of what really happened, both the good and the bad. So remember that if somebody questions whether the gospels could be trusted because the writers were converts. Well, they tell us the whole story, not just selected accounts, and they tell us both the good and the bad.
John, unfortunately, a lot of people out there who don't do good homework, they claim to do scholarly research, and what they do is they go find a copy of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, and they say, this claims that there were many more Gospels, quote unquote, than what we find in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the other ones, these were actually suppressed by the church. So are there any lost Gospels, quote unquote?
Tony, National Geographic and a few others have made a living by running up the flagpole some of these fanciful accounts about lost Gospels. Dan Brown's sold, maybe 60 million or more copies of his Da Vinci Code, claiming that the Gospels are actually like 80 Gospels, and the nonsense about how Constantine determined which books went into the Bible. Total nonsense. First of all, what I say in my book is lost Gospels is similar to the term grape nuts. Actually, breakfast cereal I used to eat a lot of. Grape nuts, the breakfast cereal, is neither grapes nor is it nuts. The lost Gospels are neither lost nor are they Gospels. They're actually works of fiction that were found in most cases in the last 100 years after having been discarded about 1700 years ago and thrown into a garbage dump because they were in essence fanciful fictional accounts that really gave us no credible information about Jesus. In fact, probably the key criteria of these so-called lost Gospels, other than the fact that they're not lost, they were discarded, and they're not Gospels, they're not true accounts, is they were written at least 100, if not more years after Jesus, some as late as 300 or 400 years after Jesus, so certainly not eyewitness accounts. They actually try to fill in the details from the Gospels when the Bible is silent. For example, from Jesus' birth to age 2, we have some accounts in the Gospels. From age 2 to age 12, silent. And then from age 12 to age 30, silent until Jesus begins his 3-year ministry. So what these so-called lost Gospels attempt to do is to fill in those infancy, childhood years of Jesus, making up stories about Jesus, making his mud pie birds come alive, things like this. And then from age 12 to age 30, perhaps having him go to India, studying under gurus, etc., really a lot of nonsense. But scholars will tell us that these so-called lost Gospels give us zero reliable information about Jesus that we wouldn't know from the actual historical Gospels. So I think we can put to rest any of the claimed that the so-called lost gospels were suppressed because they contained information the church didn't like. No, in fact, they weren't suppressed. They were dime store novels. Now, one other thing about so-called lost gospels, some of them were actually written by Christians as pious fiction, as a substitute for some of the salacious dime store novels that secularists were putting out in the second, third, and fourth centuries to give Christians some fiction to read other than that which was salacious. So some of these were intended to be fictional accounts, never intended to be actual history. So don't let anybody fool you. There are 4 reliable historical accounts of life and teachings of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's interesting, too, how we don't find thousands and thousands of manuscripts of these lost gospels, quote unquote. It's the true gospels which people copied and spread around, and we find more evidence for the Bible today, the manuscript evidence, than any other book from antiquity. Yet people say, well, these gospels, they've actually been changed from what they said originally. How do you respond to that claim?
Tony, this is the area of lower criticism, or what's called often textual criticism. And that is, regardless of who wrote these, have the documents as they were written come down to us as they were written, or have things been added and have things been taken away. Now, I had the privilege back in college years ago, back in the dark ages, of studying, taking a year of textual criticism under a scholar by the name of Harry Sturz. And Dr. Sturz was a tremendous biblical scholar and textual critic. One of my classmates happens to be one of the foremost Christian apologists in the evangelical world today, Dan Wallace, who teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. And we studied the textual criticism from beginning to end. And the more I studied the text of the New Testament, the more my faith increased by the evidence that shows these accounts we call the New Testament, or in particular the Gospels, have come down to us exactly as they were written. We have lost none of it. Now, let's just go back, let's say 400 years to Shakespeare, one of the classic writers in the English-speaking world. Shakespeare wrote about 37 plays. How many of Shakespeare's 37 plays do we have any of the original copies of? The answer is 0. We have none off the pen of Shakespeare. Of those 37 plays, how many of those have gaps where we're not really sure what he said, what he wrote originally, to be, or, well, we don't know. The answer is every single play has gaps where you have to make an educated guess, called an emendation, to determine what's there. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, how many places do we have to guess at what may have been there because it's missing? The answer is none. There's nothing missing. The original New Testament is either in the Greek Testament text or it's in one of the footnotes, the marginal readings, or the critical apparatus you have at the bottom of a Greek New Testament. Bottom line is this: even over 100 years ago, the somewhat liberal scholars Westcott and Hort came to the conclusion that the New Testament manuscripts are 99.5% reliable. That is, we clearly know what was originally written, and that 0.5% we can make educated conclusions as to what in fact was written. So the conclusion is nothing's been lost. The text of the Gospels has come down to us as originally written. That's based on the evidence from textual criticism. So you can choose not to believe it, but you can't say it's been changed down over the years.
Now, of course, John, as you know, people are going to say, well, hey, it's not 100%, so that half of 1% could mean that Christianity is entirely false. But what we see there in the manuscripts, though, has nothing to do with any major doctrine. There's not a manuscript that says, oh, Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. And this is another key factor that people need to bring into this equation as well. But also, it's not just the manuscript evidence that we have. It's also just history or historicity and archaeology. What is the verdict in regards to that? Are the historical references in the Gospels, say, like as far as people, places, titles of people, events, have these actually been confirmed by archaeology?
Let me just go back briefly to the former question, though, because you make a great point. Even Bart Ehrman says that no doctrine of the Christian faith rests on one of these variant readings of 0.5%. So you're absolutely right. There's just no evidence to conclude the Gospels aren't reliable. But just briefly, from history and archaeology, someone once said every time an archaeologist's spade goes into the ground, another liberal is buried. And sometimes when we don't have any corroborating evidence of a biblical account, skeptics will say, see, there's no evidence. So for example, the Bible makes reference to the fact that nails were used in the crucifixion of Jesus. Well, archaeologists said we've never uncovered nails being used in crucifixion in the first century. So this must be something that was made up. And as a result of this, some skeptics thought they had a great argument to refute the reliability of the Gospels. Then in 1968, they were excavating in Jerusalem, actually for a shopping center, and they discovered a box carrying bones called an ossuary. They opened it up, and on the outside, the man's name, whose bones were in there, had been written, Yochanan ben Haggagal. When they opened it up, they found out this man had been crucified because protruding from his heel bone was, in fact, a spike about 4 inches long. The man had been crucified. So the upshot is archaeology confirms the reliability of the gospel accounts. And that's just one of many examples we could give. And indeed, you go through all 6 of these questions, Tony, and the evidence supports the fact the gospels are written by the eyewitnesses during the lifetime of eyewitnesses. They were not biased. The text has come down to us intact. We've not lost any of the accounts, and history and archaeology confirm these accounts.
And John, I have about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you, what is your summary conclusion regarding the reliability of the Gospels?
Well, I'll just say people ought to get a hold of my book called In Defense of the Gospels, where I give plenty of evidence, lots of footnotes. But let me say, you can trust the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John gave us accurate eyewitness accounts of the life and the teachings of Jesus.
John, it's been a blessing to have you here. I sure hope that all of our viewers get a copy of your book, if not maybe a case of your books, and just start giving them out to family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, classmates, etc., because people need this information. There are way too many people out there who are very, very skeptical about this, and this is the type of information that they need to take this topic and deal with it once and for all, hopefully. Although, of course, skeptics are always going to be out there. But, John, it's been a blessing to have you here on Truth Matters.
Thank you, Tony.
Friends, get a copy of this book. Go to Amazon.com. Get more than one copy. Give it to a friend. Give it to a skeptic. You know, this is a great resource to do the talking for you. You can give this to a non-Christian. Say, hey, why don't you read this, at least if they like to read books, and let's talk about it. They can read this in the privacy of their own home. You're not looking over their shoulder. They can look at the evidence. And, of course, if you read it first yourself and then give them one, they can now come back to you, tell you what they thought about it. This is going to be a great conversation starter. So please get this resource and share it with other people as well. Also, check out RashioChristi.org. Please pray for us and support this ministry financially. That will allow this vital work to continue. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.